Are you ready to thrive? As a trauma therapist, author, yoga instructor, and healed human, I personally and professionally know what it means to live stuck in survival mode. I've learned a few things in my healing journey and my career that can help you transform into your best self. Join me, Rebecca Case, as I use neuroscience, psychology, spirituality, and personal experience to help you find the tools and techniques to thrive. Welcome back to Thrive the Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about EMDR therapy. Maybe you've heard of EMDR before, maybe you haven't. But after this episode, you might have a lot of curiosity and maybe a whole lot more questions and maybe a big old interest to go check it out yourself. So let's dive in. I am an EMDR therapist. I'm also an EMDR trainer. I own one of the largest EMDR training companies in the United States. I am also someone who has done a whole lot of therapy and a whole lot of EMDR on her own trauma history. So I not only believe in EMDR as an expert in it, as a therapist in it, but also as someone who has healed from it. So let's explore what the heck EMDR is, why it's useful, how it can be used for trauma, and if it might be something that you want to check out. So let's start off with the historical kind of tale of EMDR. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a ridiculously long name, so we just call it EMDR. It is a therapy. That means it is only practiced, should only be practiced by licensed mental health professionals. If you go see someone in private practice or community mental health center or a group therapy practice and they have a license in mental health and psychotherapy and counseling, those are the people who can practice EMDR. Your coach, your Reiki therapist, your massage therapist, your personal trainer are not credentialed to practice EMDR because it really is a therapy. So it is provided by therapists. EMDR was discovered and pioneered by Francine Shapiro. Francine Shapiro passed away in 2019, unfortunately, but she discovered EMDR in the late 80s. So the story goes that she was walking through the park one day thinking of something that was upsetting to her, and her eyes started moving quickly back and forth bilaterally. So her eyes were moving back and forth bilaterally as she was thinking about something that was really upsetting to her. She pauses, she notices, I feel better. Is that because my eyes were moving while I was thinking about that upsetting thing? What an observant human being, right? And so she was a therapist at the time and she had all these therapist friends. And so she was like, come here, therapist friend, let me experiment on you. Think about something upsetting to you and follow my fingers as I wave them in front of your face. And sure enough, she found that enough of her friends, enough of the people she was practicing on was saying, gosh, Francine, I feel better about that thing. Now, I know immediately you're like, what the heck is this? That sounds absurd. I know when I first heard about EMDR, I thought, that is ridiculous. What is this? Like I wave my fingers in front of somebody's face like a magic wand and poof, their trauma goes away. So of course, we had to do a lot of research on EMDR. Now, Francine Shapiro was a woman in the late 80s who was advocating for this new therapy that she discovered that involves bilateral movement of the eyes while thinking about a trauma experience. So she's going to like the boards of the APA and, these big psychiatric organizations that create the diagnoses in the DSM manual, which is the textbook of all the things that can be wrong with your mental health. And it was mostly males. It was mostly white male academics in those rooms, and they laughed at her. She thought she was full of it, that what she was talking about was nonsensical, like this is snake oil, this is pseudoscience. And so she set out to deeply, deeply research what the heck was happening so that this technique could be believed. So she did a lot of research, got a lot of quality data, and it all pointed to EMDR as an effective treatment that reduces symptoms associated with PTSD and trauma. And in fact, today, EMDR is an evidence-based therapy. So that means that there is a pool of research that supports EMDR's effectiveness, that EMDR works to treat PTSD and trauma-related symptoms. And it is actually so supported in the research that it is now considered a first-line treatment. That means if you go to treatment for PTSD, your therapist should know the best forms of treatment for PTSD based on up-to-date research. And EMDR has the research behind it that makes it at the top of that list. So there's a couple of treatments at the top of the list that are considered first-line treatments for PTSD, and EMDR is on that list. So EMDR has come a long way. It became an evidence-based therapy. I can't remember exactly, like around 2010, 2012, something like that. I can't remember exactly, but it is recognized now around the globe. It's an internationally recognized therapy. It is very well known for the treatment of PTSD. As I mentioned, there's some big celebrities who have talked about benefiting from EMDR, including Prince Harry and Miley Ray Cyrus and Sandra Bullock. So EMDR therapy is legit. And let me explain how it works, because I'm sure just on that little intro, it sounds absurd and ridiculous. It sure does. So EMDR was based on the premise that rapid eye movements that occur while you're thinking about something that is upsetting, that is distressing to you, seem to break the intensity of that distress. It seems to reduce the intensity of the distress. Now, when Francine first discovered EMDR therapy, she thought she was merely desensitizing traumatic experiences. So when you think about that terrible thing that happened to you and you receive bilateral eye movements while you're thinking about it, and there's a whole protocol that goes along with it. It's not just think about it and follow my fingers. There's a couple more steps to that. But it was believed that it was just kind of taking the sting out of that memory. So I have that memory, but when I think about it, it just doesn't hurt me anymore. But what research demonstrated, that there's a whole lot more that happens on the outcome of EMDR therapy, which is people experience a generalization effect. There's more that happens than just like that memory doesn't hurt anymore when I think of it. We see that other memories that are associated with that trauma also tend to lose their intensity. That is, when you think of other memories that are associated with that experience, they might not feel so overwhelming and intense. And we see that clients who receive EMDR therapy tend to get better on things that you didn't even work on, but are still associated with the experience. So, for example, someone that I worked with a long time ago was struggling with social anxiety and just couldn't go out into the world. And it was becoming really problematic because they were having a hard time just going to the grocery store and getting to their job and getting to family events and things like that. They were so anxious. And we had identified that this anxiety went back to some adolescent experiences of being picked on and bullied by some kids in their school. And so we started to work on those memories of being bullied in high school with EMDR therapy. And I remember after a session working on one of those memories of being bullied in high school, my client comes into the office and says, "Rebecca, I was able to go to church over the weekend." And this person hadn't been able to go to church for months, although it was something that was really important to them. And so that's considered part of the generalization effect with EMDR, is that something in their life changed, but it wasn't necessarily the direct focus of our treatment intervention. We were working on those memories associated with bullying that was creating a lot of anxiety and agoraphobia, a lot of social anxiety. They couldn't go to church. They couldn't go to the grocery store. There were lots of things that they weren't able to do. And after a session of EMDR, working on that memory from adolescence, they were able to go do something that was really meaningful to them because their anxiety had so significantly reduced. So that's the generalization effect of EMDR. So EMDR was first based on the belief that those eye movements tax our memory systems, meaning it's really hard to think about that thing from the past while you're also trying to track somebody moving their fingers in front of your face. That is the taxation of working memory hypothesis, which is not specific to EMDR, but it is found in the field of psychotherapy as one of the ways that we can help to decrease the intensity of adverse experiences. So eye movements, if you think about it, if I'm moving my fingers in front of your face pretty quickly, rapidly, we're not saying like a slow tick tock, tick tock. We're talking about like fast, like back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. Doing so, trying to focus on that movement while also thinking about the memory and the thoughts and the feelings and the body sensations that go along with it, is a lot to pay attention to. And so the taxation of working memory hypothesis asserts that, or not asserts, but demonstrates through research that when you try and focus on something that feels really painful, and you're also engaged in a dual task that is distracting you, It does something to your memory system that allows that memory to lose its intensity and integrate in an adaptive way. This has been demonstrated in studies in which people are thinking about an adverse or traumatic experience and they play a game like Tetris at the same time. You could totally experiment with that on your own if you want to. If you're feeling really upset about something, sit down and play some Tetris while you're trying to think about it. We'll talk about that on another podcast. But that's one of the beliefs of how EMDR therapy works. One of the other hypotheses that supports the effectiveness of EMDR is known as the orienting reflex. The orienting reflex is also sometimes referred to as your "what's that" reflex. So when a new stimulus comes into your awareness, you immediately, instinctively turn to orient to it so you can assess whether or not it's safe or dangerous. If your nervous system determines that that stimulus is unsafe, your neurobiology follows suit, and you have certain reactions and responses that happen in your body to protect and defend you. Those are often called fight, flight, freeze, and collapse defenses. If your nervous system assesses that is safe or there is no danger, it calms, you get a little bit more regulated, your heart rate slows down, and you can feel a bit more peace and ease in your body. So there is a belief, one of the hypotheses of how EMDR therapy works is that by asking you to think about that thing from the past, when we also engage you in bilateral stimulation, it is a way to engage your orienting reflex. So it's almost like an opportunity for your nervous system to pull up something from the past, be like, let's look at this again. Let's take a second look at this experience. And you kind of reassess it, you reappraise it from the current point of safety. Ideally, when you're doing this, you feel safe in the office with your therapist, your life is a bit safer, right? And so you can assess, oh, that was then, this is now. These are all the ways I did fight back. This is how I did say no. That wasn't my fault. My mom was ill. I am lovable. I am a good person. Gosh dang it, I am just human. You get these new insights in EMDR therapy that are available to you because you are kind of reappraising the experience from your present day perspective. The final hypothesis that supports how EMDR may be working is known as REM sleep, the REM sleep hypothesis. So you've probably heard of REM sleep before. REM sleep stands for rapid eye movement sleep, and it's a really important part of your sleep cycle. It's believed that in REM sleep is when you consolidate your memories. So when you get enough cycles of REM sleep and you feel rested, sometimes you wake up tomorrow and you really feel like, oh my gosh, I know what to do about that problem. Sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night because all of a sudden you know what to do about a problem. Or you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot that thing. That happens to me sometimes at 5 o'clock in the morning. Or you wake up the next day and you're like, you know what? That just doesn't really bother me anymore. Likewise, think about how it kind of feels like the day isn't new, or like yesterday didn't end when you didn't get a good night's sleep. You didn't get enough REM cycles. So REM sleep is important for you to consolidate and store memories in a way that doesn't make them super easy to get activate and trigger you. Now, some things are just too much to sleep off, like trauma. You can't just tell yourself, go to sleep, work through this memory, reconsolidate it so I wake up tomorrow feeling fresh and it doesn't bother me anymore. Unfortunately, your brain just doesn't work like that. So EMDR is believed to start a similar process to REM sleep while you're fully awake and you're fully conscious. You're not anesthetized, you're not unconscious, you're not hypnotized, none of those things. You're fully present, but it's believed to start kind of the similar mechanisms, the neurobiological mechanisms that happen in REM sleep while you're fully awake in the office. And it's really fascinating in EMDR therapy to witness the common theme that happens after REM sleep in therapy, which is spontaneous insight. So spontaneous insight is something that absolutely happens when we've gone through enough REM cycles. That's that moment you wake up in the morning, you're like, by golly, by gee, I know the solution to that problem that I've been trying to figure out. And I wasn't even working on it when I was asleep. Well, your brain actually was while you were asleep. Or you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about it like this. It's like this spontaneous insight that you had about a problem that you were sleeping on. And this absolutely happens in EMDR therapy, where I'll be working with a client on a trauma memory, on something that's really yucky and upsetting to them. And all of a sudden they say, oh my gosh, I wasn't able to see this before, but now I see that I did do everything that I possibly could. Or I actually have so much compassion for my parent now. I was little and I wish that they had been better when I was little, but you know what? I see that they were really struggling. So EMDR therapy tends to get us to these incredible insights that are these gifts, these takeaways that help us to find resolution with an otherwise unresolved experience. Now, I just read to you 3 hypotheses that say, like, this is kind of how we think EMDR works. Ultimately, we don't know exactly how EMDR works. We don't know how any therapy works. We don't even know why we sleep. We don't know how Prozac works. We don't know how any of our therapeutic techniques actually work. But what we know is that this technique over and over tends to result in people saying, I feel better. My trauma doesn't bother me anymore. I think about that memory and I can't even really see it. I certainly can't feel it. So this is part of the power of EMDR in my mind compared to some other therapies. There's a lot of therapies out there that do have an effect, but they're kind of like putting on constant band-aids, trying to change the way you think about something or the way you see something, or when you feel dysregulated, use this coping skill, but they're not really changing the wound at the root. And EMDR changes the wound at the root. So you don't need to try and constantly use those skills to regulate, or you don't need all those band-aids because it just doesn't hurt anymore. EMDR therapy has produced some of the most powerful, impactful, long-sustaining changes that I've seen for my clients and for myself. One of the things that makes EMDR so special is that when you get to the end of working through a target memory, we use that word in EMDR, the memories that we identify, you and your therapist identify as like, that's the stuff that's stuck and causing yuck. We got to target that. So you focus on that with the EMDR protocol. And at the end of working through that target, you're in a place where you say, when I think about that experience on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is no distress or disturbance and 10 is the worst I can imagine, it's a 0. It doesn't bother me anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that you've forgotten it, that you forgive, that you just got over it, that you put a sprinkle of positivity on it. Not at all. When we say 0 to 10, and we're measuring emotional pain and distress, we are simply measuring how activated our nervous system is. So if I ask you to think about a really terrible memory and I ask you to give me 0 to 10, how upsetting and disturbing is that to you now? You are rating the state of neurophysiological activation you are experiencing. Whether that's a bunch of anxiety, a bunch of worry, a bunch of tension, a bunch of despair or depression, you are rating how activating that memory is to your neurobiology. Trauma memories tend to be stored in a way where they get really easily activated or quote unquote triggered. I like to be careful about the word triggered because I feel that it is too casually and flippantly used in our society these days. Like anything that makes you feel uncomfortable is a trigger. And the goal is not to live free of discomfort. You're not going to grow that way. Life is not comfortable. So I'm just really careful to use the word trigger because I feel that it's kind of lost some of its emphasis and purpose, and people now just use it as a kind of catch-all for like, I don't like the way that feels, versus when people are like, I am really triggered, my trauma is triggered. That's a different story. So anyway, trauma memories, unresolved adverse experiences, things that have been really stressful in your life and have gotten stuck in your neurobiology. And you know they're stuck because you're reliving them, because you re-experience them, because you feel chronically activated, anxious, or shut down. Those memories tend to be stored in a way that they get really easily set off. And they can get set off by a whole bunch of different things. They might get set off because of a similar place you're in, a similar smell, a sound, a texture. They might be triggered because of a similar feeling or a body sensation or a thought or belief. So all kinds of things, anniversaries, times of years, like all of these things can sometimes activate our trauma memories. And when those trauma memories get activated, they tend to hijack our neurobiology. So all of a sudden, this memory gets activated in your brain. Maybe you're aware of it. Maybe you didn't even know it got activated, and you start feeling all of the distress in your nervous system. Maybe your heart starts racing, your mind starts racing. It's hard to breathe. You feel sick to your stomach. You feel really uneasy. And maybe you're like, I know what's happening. I'm triggered. Or maybe you're like, I have no idea what the hell is happening, but it seems that I'm triggered, but I don't know what about. So trauma memories get activated really easily in that way, and they just kind of sweep us away. EMDR therapy helps your brain to reconsolidate that memory so it's stored differently. So it's not like a landmine in your brain. It's not so easily activated, or it doesn't get activated at all in relationship to things that used to trigger it. And so when you think of that memory now, or even when things activate it, you say 0 to 10, my nervous system is not getting flared up because I recognize that was then and this is now, or because I've learned the lessons from it, or it's just stored differently and I can't feel it anymore. I've had clients in EMDR therapy say to me at the end of sessions things like, I can't even picture it. Like, I just can't even see the scene. Like, I know that it happened, but I don't see the terrible thing that I saw before. They may say things like, I just feel neutral about it. I feel at peace about it. I feel like it's over. I feel free. And the beautiful thing is that that stuff doesn't come back. It's not like this is a placebo effect and it's going to wear off after 2 weeks. Folks after EMDR therapy, research shows, tend to stay better and actually tend to get better over time. So the work that you do in EMDR therapy actually really frees your nervous system from a host of other things it was probably really struggling with. And it creates more resiliency for yourself in the future. Because when you're free of those experiences that are just so easily activated and triggered, you're just more free in your life and you're going to have more resiliency available to you. So EMDR started off by solely being focused on eye movements. We thought it was just about eye movements, but it's not only eye movements now that we use in EMDR therapy for bilateral stimulation. So clients can also tap back and forth. There's buzzers that therapists can purchase. Then the client holds a buzzer in each hand and they just kind of vibrate back and forth in your hands. So it's bilateral stimulation there, tactile. We can also use audio tones so that the client might listen to headphones, to music on headphones that beeps back and forth in the ears. So it's not just about eye movements anymore. And actually, a lot of my clients seem to prefer tapping or those buzzers, but everybody's different and you can choose whichever form of bilateral stimulation works for you best. So I've mentioned numerous times that EMDR therapy is evidence-based for PTSD and trauma, but it's not only PTSD that we can use EMDR to help with. EMDR can also be useful with depression, with anxiety, with panic, with addictions, disordered eating, grief and loss, chronic pain, performance anxiety, and just mildly disturbing experiences. I have personally used EMDR for a whole lot of things. I have used EMDR for my own trauma. I used EMDR to work through a sexual assault for my teenage years. I used EMDR to work through a domestic violence relationship that I experienced for about 5 years in my life. I used EMDR to work through my father's suicide. And I've also used EMDR to work through just some mildly disturbing experiences, like an uncomfortable experience with my boss or an argument with a friend. Or I think I once used it for a really disturbing story that a client told me that got stuck in my head, something that was just really traumatic and really gruesome. And my mind was holding on to these images that were really bothering me. So you can use EMDR with all kinds of things. EMDR is also useful for adults and children and even older adults. So there's no age limit for EMDR. In fact, there are some therapists out there that even practice EMDR with infants. Pretty amazing stuff. EMDR translates across cultures because it's focused on neurobiology. And so it's used around the globe and practiced on every continent. EMDR therapy may sometimes be really short, It might only take you a couple of sessions to work through to your goals, and sometimes it can take longer. It really depends on the trauma, the issue that you're showing up to address. If you're showing up with some really long stemming trauma, some stuff that's been around for a long time with a lot of different experiences, that tends to be longer treatment and therefore also takes a little bit longer in EMDR therapy. Not always, I'm saying tends to. If you're coming in for something more specific, especially if it just happened, you can use EMDR therapy for recent traumatic events. And EMDR therapy for recent traumatic events is actually shown to likely reduce the outcome of how those recent events tend to impact your mental health down the road. So if you seek out EMDR therapy after something traumatic has happened in your life, it seems to be, the research indicates that you will be less likely to go on to develop some major mental health issues like PTSD, anxiety, depression, addictions, and so forth. Now, it's important to know that while EMDR therapy sounds magical, it's not, and it still takes some work. Sometimes people mistake EMDR to sound like, oh, you mean I don't got to feel my feelings, or I don't got to really be with this trauma. It's just like a magic bullet. That does not exist. So to benefit from EMDR therapy, to be a good candidate for EMDR reprocessing, working through those trauma memories, you need to have some skills in place. You need to be able to tolerate feeling your feelings. You need to be able to feel your body, and you need to have some skills to regulate yourself. EMDR can be kind of a kick your butt therapy. It's like physical therapy for your brain, for trauma, for adverse experiences. So if you're just struggling to cope on a daily basis, it's important that you and your therapist first do some work to build a bit more resiliency in your neurobiology before you dive into those trauma memories. Because if you jump into trauma memories too quickly without enough preparation in your neurobiology, you tend to feel worse. And most therapists are not in the business of making their clients feel worse. If you are listening and you are somebody who has done EMDR therapy before and you found that it made everything worse, your therapist might have skipped some steps, and maybe they didn't prepare you in the way that your nervous system really needed to be prepared to have the success that you were shooting for. So maybe try another therapist and don't necessarily kick EMDR out the door. So while EMDR can be incredibly impactful, you have to have some skills in place to really be able to benefit from it. If you are seeking an EMDR therapist, or if you would like to learn more, in the United States, you can check out, the United States and Canada and really Northern America, you can check out the EMDR International Association. That's emdria.org, emdria.org. EMDRIA is the governing, regulating body of all things EMDR in Northern America. You can find lots of information on EMDR, find links to research, get some of your questions answered, and you can also search for an EMDR therapist on there through their therapist portal. You can also go to psychologytoday.com, which is one of my favorite search engines to search for therapists. In psychologytoday.com, you can put in your zip code. You can state that you are seeking out an EMDR therapist specifically and find individuals in your area who might even take your insurance and also work on the specific issues that you're wanting to work on. You can filter that well on psychologytoday.com. There is no diagnosis that in and of itself is a rule out for EMDR. So that means that even if you're like, I don't have PTSD, doesn't mean that you couldn't benefit from EMDR. EMDR therapy is really useful for stuff that's stuck and causing us yuck, meaning life happened to us and we haven't been able to move forward in some way, shape, or form. There's some experience, whether it's in the past or might even be in the future, that you feel like you're really stuck in. You're ruminating about it. You're thinking about it. It tends to be causing you to respond in ways you'd prefer not to respond to the world and to other people. If this sounds like you, then EMDR therapy might be right up your alley. Remember, EMDR is not magical, and you got to do some work. You got to feel to heal, people. You're not going to heal if you don't feel your feelings. And remember, those feelings are full of lots of messages and lots of information for your personal growth and wellness. Thanks for listening to another episode of Thrive the Podcast. Thrive on. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Thrive the Podcast. I hope these insights inspire positive changes in your life. If you're ready to take the next step in your Thrive journey, check out goodies linked in the show notes and on my website, RebeccaCase.com. Sign up for my newsletter and get access to helpful resources, connect with my community, and be the first to know about events and happenings. Remember, your journey from surviving to thriving is unique, and you have the power to create your best life. Subscribe, share, and thrive into your potential. Until next time, this is Rebecca Case, signing off. Thrive on.